Okay, so welcome to Fundamentals of Research Design. My name is Michael Crowe. The aim of today then is just to provide a general overview of research study designs or research methods. Research methods, we will particularly be looking at research design in general, spend a lot of time there, but there are other things that are involved as well. The idea behind this presentation is to show the possibilities of what's available within research and putting together your research. It's not set out as that you should remember all of this or that you have to do all of this. You actually choose the bits that are suitable for your research question and what your research is. So yes, what I'm going through is perhaps a little bit complicated, or at least there's an awful lot to remember, but you just don't have to know it all, because that's basically what TAAHC is here for, is to help you through that process of doing your research. If you wish, you can interrupt at any time, or you can wait till the end, whichever you're comfortable with. This actually usually works a little bit better if I'm interrupted, because otherwise I just go on a flow and I don't know if I'm hitting the right ideas or not. You may have seen this before, that the general research process is often described as, yes, you do some background and literature, and then you decide on your research problem, and then you do your research design, sampling technique, and all the rest of it. And in fairness, this presentation as well is going to follow that sort of very linear format. And that's the way it's told. You might have done, modules or subjects on research design, and it's all very linear and it seems all very, logical. Just follow each bit and away you go. However, the reality is that it all kind of happens all together. Yes, you should probably do some literature and background first, because that really sort of primes you for what it is that you want to do and why you want to do it. But all of the rest of it sort of happens in a sort of higgledy-piggledy. So it's a good idea to have a general understanding of what's required and what needs to be done, so that you can know that different bits are being done at the same time, even though it says it's linear. This whole talk is based on a concept map that I did of research methods. Now, I haven't provided it to you originally, because it is kind of complicated, and sometimes it sort of puts fear in people rather than showing just what's available. So it can be downloaded from my website, which isn't any great shakes, but you'll find it pretty quickly if you go to conquer.com.au. You can email me and just ask for me to send it to you, and that's perfectly fine too. I can do that as well. And it's all based around a paper that I wrote for my PhD as well, which is quite some time ago at this stage. I noticed just looking at the date on it. So as I say, I'm going to go through the research methods and go through each part of it and just interrupt if nothing or something doesn't make sense, or you want me to concentrate on something in particular. All right, so the research problem is usually broken up to what is the purpose of the research, or what is the problem statement. One of the great things about research methods is that there are several ways to say the exact same thing, and some people use the same words to mean something completely different to what you know. So it just, to make it all crystal clear for you, it tries to do this. But the way I look at it, and the way that I've seen it, is, okay, you come up with your research purpose, then you divide that up into your aims, and if required, you divide that further into objectives or into hypotheses. You don't necessarily have to have anything other than one aim. You don't have to have multiple objectives. You don't even have to have hypotheses before you start. The usual thing, though, is to concentrate a lot on the question, because it's always best to have a good question and a concrete idea of what it is you're trying to achieve first before going into the later stages, because it just helps you to, because doing research is kind of going into a down rabbit holes. It's always a good idea to have what the question is foremost, so that when you do go into that rabbit hole, which you will go into, that you do have the question to go back to and say, okay, all that stuff is nice, and it would be really great to look at it, but actually what my main focus at the moment is this. And then it gets you back to what you really want to do rather than what you think you might be looking at. A lot of the time it's shown as PICO. So setting up your question as patient, intervention, comparison, outcome, and time frame, which is really nice. But PICO doesn't quite work because it depends on what you're actually trying to do. Sometimes there isn't an intervention. You don't actually have an intervention. You might have an exposure if you're looking at more epidemiological things. You might have some sort of treatment. It depends. And sometimes you do or don't have a comparison depending on if you have an intervention. So if you don't have an intervention, then you're not going to have a comparison. If you have an exposure, you will have a comparison, but yeah, it all is in there. There are several other ways of doing this as well. There's one called Cocoa Pop, surprisingly enough, and it's just looks at condition, context, and population, which can be helpful if you're looking at other things. But there's also just different ways of looking at your research problem. If you're more qualitative, there's two. There's one called SPICE and there's one called SPIDER. And if you're looking at healthcare management areas, there's an acronym called ECLIPSE. So you don't have to go down PICO if it doesn't help you, but it is something that is there. And for most people, it works, at least some of the time anyway. So that's the research problem. Then you get into the research design, and I know this one is way too small. I'm actually going to split it up as we go through it. And what I'm going to do is first look at the quantitative research designs, then qualitative, and then other things beyond that. The one that we most get told about is true experimental design or randomized controlled trials. And considered to be, you'll see it in lots of places in NHMRC and in guidelines and stuff, that it's the gold standard. I actually come from a social science background, in marketing and IT. So the idea that there's some sort of gold standard for research is not something that I came across until I started doing health research. And then suddenly I was told that, you're supposed to aim towards randomized controlled trials. Yes, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So it always comes back to your question. You have to know what your question is first before you then decide if a randomized controlled trial is required to answer that question. Some things with randomized controlled trials are that there is an intervention, or there has to be an intervention or some sort of treatment that's under the control of the researcher, so that they can give one group the intervention and the other group gets usually normal treatment rather than a placebo. So you have to have a minimum of 2 groups. It's absolutely vital. If you don't have 2 groups, you can't be doing a randomized controlled trial, basically. The important thing then is that participants are randomly allocated to those groups. So if you've got 3 groups, they're randomly allocated to 3 groups, but it doesn't really matter. They are randomly assigned to the groups. The other thing is, and this has become more important, is that group allocation is concealed, especially where you can. If at all you can conceal allocation, you should. And that's usually, it's called double blinding, and that's where the participant and the assessor, so the person doing the treatment or giving out the drug or whatever, and the participants, both of them are blinded it to what's happening. I'll talk more about this later because double blinding isn't sort of the only thing that you can do. Quasi-experimental designs are very much the same. Even the different types of designs that are laid out there are almost exactly the same as for true experimental designs, but there's no random assignment to the groups. Okay, so again, you have to have a minimum of 2 groups, but participants go into the groups by various methods. Usually the best way to do it is if the participants form some sort of natural group or natural grouping rather than the researcher deciding who goes into which group. The problem with researchers deciding who goes into which group or someone else deciding is that we're really, 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 really bad at doing things like that in a sort of even semi-randomized way. We have our biases and we have our background thoughts, and as a result, we tend to allocate people to groups where we think they'll do best, even if it's subconsciously, rather than where they necessarily should go. So that's why I say it's usually better if the participants are in some sort of natural groups rather than someone deciding which groups they go into. Then there's single system. There's lots of different single system, and it's known by lots of different names as well. So in psychology, there's a lot of N of 1 studies, is what they're called there. In other areas, they're called single subjects. And in other areas, again, it's time, there's time series as well. Again, you're still testing some sort of intervention, but you've only got one group, or you've only got a single patient, or you've got a series of single patients, or a series of participants. It really depends on how it's set up. And there's lots of ways of doing it. It's really good because one of the things that we've found out doing research is that randomized controlled trials are fine, but sometimes you need to have crossovers. So you need to have it so that the participants get the intervention and don't get the intervention at various times, because it actually gives you better information. Because what we want to know is it's okay to know what's happening in general, and when you're looking at things like vaccines or antibiotics, or those sort of big drugs that go across lots of different people, knowing what's happening on average is fine. But when you're looking at more targeted therapies or interventions, then knowing what's happening just at a population base on average doesn't quite cut it anymore. You kind of need to know who is best targeted by these interventions. And so you get things like time series in order to do that, and things like multiple baseline, which help with that. And you can then do randomized controlled trials with aspects of things like time series in them as well, if you get really complicated. But again, it depends on what your question is. Then there's a sort of a grouping, and it depends on your area, whether they're called descriptive, exploratory, or observational research designs. Basically, within all of these, there is no intervention, or at least there's no control over what the intervention is. Some people get the intervention, so it might be, that the government has decided to pour a pot of money at a particular group. Well, then they become the intervention, even though they're not really. Sometimes, yes, you can call those quasi-experimental studies because you have groups that get the intervention and some that don't, but sometimes they're more or better thought of as descriptive or exploratory, where you can't necessarily have a comparator or any sort of control or comparison group. So surveys fall into this one, and lots of people do surveys. You can have cross-sectional ones, which are ones that we're very familiar with, that you get rung up or you get asked to do a survey. But there's also longitudinal or panel surveys that have been going on for years and years and years, which are really good. Within epidemiology, talk about cohort studies an awful lot. But if you're into things like pediatrics or that sort of area, there's sort of developmental and normative studies that get done in this area too. And also case studies. So, the famous Guess What Happened Today, like that, what was it, that woman who had a python parasite in her brain lately, and it gets written up as a case study. So, all sorts of weird, strange things get put in here. For your research. Qualitative designs, I'm not going to go huge into this. I have done qualitative research, but I've moved back into doing more quantitative at this stage. But there is lots and lots of qualitative types of qualitative. The most common one done in health are phenomenology and grounded theory. Phenomenology is where you're looking at how people, what they make of different things that happen to them, like having cancer or having a disease or recovering from some disease, and what it means to them, what they have experienced. So the disease or the recovery or the cancer is the phenomenon that's under discussion. Grounded theory is where you don't really have any idea what is happening or why it's happening, and you build up some sort of theory from individual people's experiences. There are others there as well, and if anyone has a sort of more social science background, get really into the different types of qualitative research and what they mean. So it's good to get some help if you're looking at qualitative research for the first time. The one thing to remember though is, and it's something that drives me nuts, qualitative research is a completely different way of looking at research than quantitative. It looks at research from an individual perspective and trying to understand an individual, but taking into consideration what me or you or anyone as a researcher, what your experience is as well. So as a researcher, you aren't coloring other people's experiences. So it can be quite interesting to do. And what you find in quantitative research is, and this is the bit that drives me nuts, is that people have qualitative questions within their quantitative research. And no, you don't. Really, because there are different approaches. They're still research, they're just different ways of looking at the world. Then there's mixed methods, which have become much more useful and used, I suppose is a better word, which is using both qualitative and quantitative research to try and come up with sort of that general picture of what's happening, as well as that individual picture of what's happening based on your research question. Lots and lots been done, a lot more mixed methods been done to try and get both points of view. What I do here, which is a bit weird, is I put action research in here, which includes participative action research, because a lot more action research is becoming more mixed methods than purely action research. There tends to be some sort of quantitative component to it now. All right, if you're a pure qualitative action researcher, then you'll argue with me over that, and that's fine, because you can do that, but there is a little bit of a drift more towards a quantitative understanding as well there. Ooh, sorry, that was me. Research synthesis is considered a distinct research design on its own now. The most common one that you'll have heard of are systematic reviews, which is a whole way of doing research. But within that sort of minorly, there's things like critical reviews, rapid reviews, and scoping reviews that are considered, mini projects. And those are all tend to be quantitative in sort of philosophy, I suppose. And even within systematic reviews now, you get umbrella reviews, which are systematic reviews of systematic reviews. So all, and then on the qualitative end, you can do research synthesis as well of different types, different qualitative research, and trying to put them all together as well. So that's that one. And then lastly, because this gets asked a little bit, is how does this whole idea of what I've shown of research designs, how does that fit into the NHMRC levels of evidence and what NHMRC are looking for? So systematic reviews of level 2 studies or randomized controlled trials is a systematic review. Randomized controlled trials, as I've said already, are all the true experimental studies. Quasi-experimental studies are what NHMRC called non-randomized experimental trials. Interrupted time series or multiple time series is something that I have in there. Comparative studies without concurrent controls or single systems, interrupted time series without parallel controls or simple time series, case series or case series. The only one that I leave out because I have, and there's cohort studies and various things for observational research in there as well. I have observational, but it should say descriptive exploratory as well. Is this the whole idea of pseudo-randomized controlled trials? My view, and I'm sure people will contradict me, is that if it's a pseudo-randomized controlled trial, it's quasi-experimental. There's basically no such thing as a pseudo-randomized controlled trial. It's either a randomized controlled trial or it's not a randomized controlled trial. So that's my personal view on it. Others may have different ideas on it. Any questions so far? Because that's probably about the halfway point, and that's all the stuff about research designs.
No questions from me so far, I don't think. Thank you. This is very helpful though, just yeah, it's been very helpful for me so far. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Happy to help.
And also, it's been great, but no questions so far. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. I'll keep going. Do interrupt though. Sampling technique. Now, I will. The rest of the stuff I'm going to go through at a good clip, because really the first things, if you're starting research, the good things to look at are your question and your research design, and then get more into the technical aspect of things. So again, this is just, it's to give you ideas of where things go rather than you need to understand it all. Just remember that bit. So within sampling then, the two things within sampling are probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Unfortunately, what most people get taught and what most people remember is probability sampling. And basically within human research designs, it's very difficult to do probability sampling. Unless you're doing cluster sampling, you probably won't be doing any sorts of probability sampling. Most health research is done in a non-probability way. Within that, the two that people get mixed up with are convenience sampling and purposive sampling. Convenience sampling is that you choose people just because they happen to be available. So if I was doing a survey at the moment of health services in North Queensland, and you guys that are here, if I said, oh, well, you're here, so I'll ask you, that would be a convenience sample. And it obviously has a huge number of problems, because usually with convenience samples, the people that you're asking are not representative at all of the population that you might have an idea about. What a lot of happens within in health research is purposive sample within the quantitative area. So it's based on judgment. It's based on deciding who should or shouldn't be involved, based on selection criteria and stuff like that. Quota sampling is also used a lot in quantitative. It's especially one that's used in surveys. Snowballing is something that used to be done a lot in qualitative research, but it's quite frowned upon these days because it can lead to very biased look at the world, because basically you're looking at one participant and you're asking them to nominate contact people within their social group to be parts of the research. So as you can see, that could lead to just getting one set of points of view very quickly. It is still used quite a bit, especially where the population you're looking at. And when I say population, I don't mean, you know, all of Australia. I mean that group of people that you're really interested in looking at. But if that group of people is very hidden, in that they, you know, something like HIV or something like that, where people don't go around stating that they have are HIV positive, then snowballing can be something that can be used because you can access that hidden group a lot easier, and theoretical is used within qualitative research. So there's lots of different non-probability types of sampling. The next thing you have to think of is size. And that's where statisticians like me do all sorts of statistical calculations to try and come up with a sample size for quant stuff. Qual research is done based on other ideas, such as looking at extreme cases or typical cases or something along those lines, or looking at having degrees of variation within the sample. One that's used within qualitative a lot is saturation. And that's where you have interviewed so many people that the exact same themes are coming up again and again. So you've hit redundancy is another word, so there's no need to go talking to more people. One that isn't talked about a lot, but probably should be a bit more, is sampling based on budget. This happens a lot within survey research, but it can happen within other types of research as well, where it's based on how much money do I actually have to access people. And a lot of people doing, especially if you're doing research for the first time, you don't have a budget at all, and you kind of have to take that into consideration of, you know, how much is this going to cost me or my organization. So you can do things around budget as well as a method. And then finally, for sample size, we have a process. You have to decide who your population is. So who are the people you actually want to be part of your research? That's both qualitative and quantitative. You have to figure that one out. Quantitative, it becomes a little bit more complex. Qualitative, perhaps not so much. You have eligibility as well. So who gets included, who gets excluded. And then within quantitative, and especially where you've got different groups of people, you have to decide who goes into what group, how it happens, how do you balance those groups, and all sorts of sort of questions around that. Within ethical matters then, moving swiftly along, the most emphasized is participant ethics, and there's very good reasons for that, obviously, but you have to look at things like that participation is voluntary. Again, this is why you can't have what's the word? You can't randomly select people in health research, is because participation is generally voluntary. So how can you randomly assign or randomly choose people if they can say no? So is part of the thing there. Protecting the participants and having attention to various aspects of cultural respect and equitable actions, things like that. So I'm not an ethicist, but I do understand where it's coming from. One of the things that isn't generally emphasized is researcher ethics. So you as a researcher have to do things like get ethical approval. People know that, but it's usually couched in terms of the participant rather than the researcher as well. And this is where qualitative research has really shown how a researcher can influence how research happens and how results happen. Within quantitative research, it's known as researcher degrees of freedom, where the researcher makes choices. But sometimes those choices are made, but there's conflicts in the background, and NHMRC has other things in there as well, things around authorship and data management, peer review, and all sorts of other things that go into researcher ethics, not just the participant. So it's worthwhile considering those as well. All right, moving on to data collection. The procedure for data collection then is, and it's the same for qualitative and quantitative, one, organizing yourself, getting things together. How are you going to do this? When are you going to do it? Where are you going to do it? What materials do I need for my research? So that's sort of very, fundamental stuff. And then you go into participants. How am I going to recruit them? What am I going to do with non-participation? Is there anything to be done with incomplete data or lost data? And one of the really important ones, if you're doing anything randomized controlled trial or anything that's more risky from a research point of view, is stopping rules. When do I stop? How do I know I should stop doing what I'm doing? Because either A, it's showing that my intervention is so good, it should actually be used on a larger population, or B, my intervention is actually causing some sort of harms for participants, and we really should just stop because it's a bad idea. And that happens every now and again. That's research and introducing new different therapies and drugs is risky. And that's why for things like randomized controlled trials, there'll be things like data monitoring committees who will look at the data to check to make sure harm isn't been done. One thing that's often overlooked in doing research is looking at the quality of the data and making sure that the data are consistent, so that if you're, say you're introducing a new medical device, you have to know that it's set up properly to collect your data. Even if you're just using a medical device, that it's set up properly, it's calibrated, it's tested, things like that, so that you're getting accurate information out of it. Back to blinding, which I mentioned in randomized controlled trials. I mentioned about participant and assessor blinding, which is participant and input here, but also you can blind the researcher to who's getting the treatment and who's not. And you can also blind the analysis so that the person who's analyzing the data is also blinded to who's getting the treatment and who isn't. So double blinding is something that gets thrown around a lot, but there's actually more ways of blinding than just than the two. Within qualitative research, looking at quality is a thing called triangulation, and you can do this in quantitative as well, but within qualitative, it's collecting data based on, for example, multiple observers, or using different measures, or using different theories or approaches to your research. So triangulation is another method of looking at the quality of the data that's been collected. Data collection methods. This is a little bit technical, so don't worry too much about it. And I understand that this is a bit technical. So the first thing that you can do when you're collecting data is through an audit or through a review. So if you're doing a chart review, this is where it goes in. If you're doing a systematic review, it's of secondary sources of information, whereas a chart review would be of primary sources. Observation can happen either at a qualitative or quantitative research level. So that is observing what's happening. Going over onto the right-hand side, you can do interviews, which covers an awful lot. So, for example, a questionnaire is a highly structured interview, basically. That's what it's considered. Whereas a qualitative interview would be an unstructured or semi-structured interview. And then you can do the last sort of way of data collecting is through testing. So things like randomized controlled trials, interventions in epidemiology as well. And if you're into psychometrics, it comes in here as testing things like creating standardized tools for testing things. Medical devices are also standardized tools as well. So it's a very technical way of looking at it. So I'll just leave it at that. Focus groups I have in there as well has been an interview. So where there's a interviewer and lots of interviewees. And then we get into data analysis. This is split up, into essential, your methods and interpretation. So the essential data analysis, again, for qual and quant, what is your data flow? So you need to know how your data happened and what it actually, from top to bottom, how it flows. I can't think of a better description than that. Looking at your raw data becomes really important in both qual and quant, especially in quasi-experimental and single system data is having baseline data. You have to have baseline measures for quasi-experimental and single systems. Theoretically, you don't need baseline data for randomized controlled trials, but it's usually considered a good idea to collect it anyway. But you don't actually need it. The randomization component into each group takes care of that. Again, looking at incomplete data and lost data and trying to figure out why that's happened or is it going to affect results. Your methods usually split into statistical and non-statistical. Self-reflection within non-statistical methods is usually considered qualitative, but it's also a good idea within quantitative to consider what your assumptions and presumptions are, because sometimes we have them and it can send us down a rabbit hole again of analyzing data, and if we get back out of them, it can actually help us to do quantitative better. Within qualitative, organizing the data, categorizing it, synthesizing it, interpreting it all comes in here. And then there's specific types of data analysis for qualitative, like thematic analysis, which is looking at themes within interviews, content analysis, which is, it is a qualitative, part of qualitative. It looks more at I can't even begin to describe it at the moment. Sorry, it's lost. But there's just different ways of looking at data. Constant comparative method is something in qualitative that has become more used as well. It's constantly comparing what you have done already to what you collect and looping back up and down the chain. Statistical analysis, descriptive and inferential is how it's usually split. Descriptive data is things like means, variance, standard deviations, correlations, ratios, all those sort of things. Inference then looks at other things, and usually a good idea to have a stats person on hand to help you out with it, unless, just for a second brain, if nothing else. Meta-analysis itself is a statistical technique. People sometimes say that their research is that they're doing is a meta-analysis. Usually your research design is a systematic review, and within that you're doing a meta-analysis of the data to get results. So within a systematic review, you don't necessarily have to do a meta-analysis, but it is a component there. And then interpreting, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, you do have to interpret your data. Surprisingly enough, what do the data mean? Is the data valid? Is the data reliable? How do we know this? Within qualitative and in quantitative, what you can do is you can what's called data conversion. So if you've got quantitative data converted into a more qualitative point of view, if you've got qualitative data converted into a more quantitative. I haven't really seen much of that done, to be honest, but it's there. And just comparing your data. So that's basically, does my data make sense considering all the other research that's been done? So it's just, it's, or, if I'm getting this sort of results and it's way different to other people, is there a reason behind that? And then the last thing that you do is you report your findings, because if you've done all the hard work, you may as well get a publication out of it or write the damn report and get it done. And a lot of the time, your reporting is a lot of what you've gone through, the steps you've gone through for doing your research. What is the background? What was the research problem? What research design did I use? What were the ethics involved? How did I do sampling? What data collection was done? What data analysis did I do? And then you contextualize it all. Here are my findings. Here's what previous research did. Is it the same? Is it different? Or somewhere in between. So, it tends to be a lot of the writing up is how you've done all the research process to begin with. And you can actually write up lots of it before you even get results, because, well, you should have done all the hard work before you get the results anyway. All right, I think this is my last slide. Yes. All right. Hopefully you didn't get overwhelmed by this. The point was to show that there are lots of options, and that you don't actually, having some sort of a plan is a good thing. Knowing that there are more options available than you necessarily knew, because if the only thing you'd ever read about or seen was randomized controlled trials, but you were really interested in figuring out how individual patients reacted to different treatments, you'd be going, how do I do that with a randomized controlled trial? And the thing is, well, hold on. If we go back to your question, that's really a very qualitative question. And, maybe we need to look at it from that point of view. Just remember that TAAHC as well is not just for stats. So my title is, and it is cutting it down a little bit, about study design, epidemiology, and biostat support. So it's not just stats. I'm supposed to help people with study designs as well. And usually the best time to get help with your research is at the very, very beginning, which is when you're defining your research problem. Because what can happen then is, with someone who has sort of an overview, or if you have an overview of all the research, it can help you to cut out swathes of options that really are immaterial to your research question. It can help you to, I worked in IT for a while, and we have a thing in it called having a second brain. And it's no matter how sure you are your approach is correct, it's always a good idea to pass it by someone else, or even lots of someone else's, just to be sure you haven't missed something that's so blindingly obvious that you've completely overlooked it. And so getting help with your research, it's best is early. Just asking people, look, here's my question, here's the research design I was considering. And then someone else can say, oh, have you thought about all of these aspects of it? Or can say, oh, good, if you're going down that way, that means all of these things you don't have to worry about. And you can go, oh, yeah, cut out half the work. And things like that, tips, tricks, especially if it's your first time or you haven't had huge amounts of experience. Help with research with sampling, both qual and quant, defining, calculating. The qual is a little bit different. Ethical matters, I don't know if TAAHC do an awful lot on that, and I know that the various health services and JCU as well have ethics people on board. Data collection definitely can help there, because we can help in setting it up so that you collect your data in the easiest way possible. Data analysis, sure. Reporting your findings, well, we can help you interpret the results, but really it's up to you to report things when it comes down to it. Okay, so thank you very much. That is my presentation. If you have any questions, please ask.
Michael, I probably do have one question, and I don't know. I'll ask it anyway. I think I keep going to what we're trying to figure out and how to make sure we're structuring, say, survey questions in a way that makes sure we're finding out what we want to find out.
Yep.
And are there any resources or tools you can point me in the direction of in terms of setting up survey questions, or making sure you're collecting the data that you want to be collecting, or that that you're setting out to collect? Or is that something that we can get in touch with you about? Or
you certainly can. I have done a talk on questionnaire design. It is out there somewhere. If you go to the TAAHC website, I think our TAAHC have a YouTube channel, and it'll be on that. Is one. Two, one of my first jobs was putting together questionnaires. So yes, I'm happy to help with that. Third one, depending on your questionnaire as well, or what you're trying to find out, you may find, and this is where, I'll say two things about that. One is sometimes there are validated, reliable questionnaires, questions that can be used and can be stolen freehand, they can be used. They are there to be used. It depends on what you're looking at. So like there are validated questionnaires to find information on so many different things. Like things like the K10 for depression, which I actually don't like, but anyway, that's just me. A questionnaire design, remember, or the SF36 or the cut down versions of it. So they're ones that people have heard of, but there are lots and lots and lots more ones as well. And the other thing that I say is, if you can find someone else's questionnaires and they're happy for you to use them, steal them. It's the one time where stealing other people's ideas is a really good thing to do, because it is quite hard to come up with questions yourself and groups of questions. A better idea is to look to see, has anyone done the hard work first.
Yeah. Right.
So there's those, and yes, do contact if you have other questions about it.
Great, thank you.
Michael, my questions around questionnaires as well.
Yeah, no worries.
I did attend your questionnaire presentation, and it was really great. I found it very enlightening. I'm just pulling together a research. I've done the protocol. It's been ethics approved. It's an action research on emergency department access in Townsville, Cairns, Mackay and Rockhampton.
Yep.
And one of the arms of the protocol is looking at data around people that present to the emergency department if they've had the presenting issue for longer than 7 days. And if they have, what have they done about it? Like what, or not what have they done about it, but have they accessed services?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, like, you know, like, because what we're finding in practical land is that people are going to their local GP or hospital, and then that's not working for whatever reason, and then the condition gets worse, and then they'll go sit in Mackay ED for like 7 hours, and then they get jack of that, and then they go to the private ED in you know, in Mackay. And then so the purpose of doing this is trying to look at the person's journey, I
Yep.
suppose. I might be biting off more than I can chew. I've looked at data sources, and because it's mainly in primary care or outside of hospitals, it's difficult to sort of like get it electronically, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
We can access MBS items, but so then after your session on questionnaires, I just went back and I looked at the questionnaire, and I think I've approached it in the wrong way, because you're saying like ask the question and then grading, like leading the person through the questionnaire so that it makes sense, like
Yep.
from a logical perspective, and it didn't. And
Yep.
sorry, my camera's not working on this
That's
computer.
okay.
That's why it's not on. And so with what I'm trying to achieve, is that too much of a task for one questionnaire? Being in mind that we're talking about hundreds of people.
Yeah, and um, two things, I suppose. One is you said something about action research, and then you were talking about the questionnaire. And yes, I did say in action research you can have a quantitative and a qualitative component to it. But that just threw me for a second, even
Okay.
so.
Okay.
But it depends on where you're going to give out the questionnaire as well. And whether it's going to be electronic or paper. So there are a number of factors.
We've been circling that precise question that you've just asked, because
Yeah,
like when people turn up to the emergency department, normally they're wanting to be seen quickly,
yeah,
and don't really give much
yeah,
to sort of like answering questions.
yeah. So in that state, then you're probably it'll have to be if you're trying to collect data at that point, it would have to be reasonably short.
Yeah, yep.
You know, you're looking at 3-5 minutes.
Yeah,
That
and I was
sort of.
thinking, like, you know, you rock into ED, you get
Yeah,
seen by the nurse, and she
yeah,
tried, or he or she triages you,
yeah,
and then generally you move on to the admin assistant.
yeah,
And so I was wondering, like, whether at that point of the admin, when they're capturing, you know, your
yeah.
address and all that sort of stuff, like whether they would be the best to ask the questions and just complete the questionnaire collaboratively with them, or whether you should just do a
Um,
QR code and they scan it
okay.
with their phone and answer it that way? Or
Uh,
can you do both? Or
okay, well, again, a number of things. One, you'd obviously have to get permission, and I don't know how easy that would be
yeah, I've already got the permission. Like that's,
for the
yeah,
admin person.
yes.
The second one is that generally, and you will have noticed this maybe as well if you've rung up any businesses or whatever, is that you don't really want the person asking the questions to interpret the questions for the respondent.
Yep.
You actually have to state the questions in a way that are clear for the person answering them. And
Okay.
they don't require clarification by the person administrating. This is why when you ring up and you say my phone is broken and they start going through a checklist sort of thing, it's
Okay.
because it's to take away the
the potential for different understandings of what
endings
you're
of
asking.
what you're asking and what you're
Okay.
trying to achieve. And that would be the same for this, that you'd have to be careful in designing it, that it was logical, that it wasn't so complex that it couldn't be done.
Because I work in
and
an emergency department,
yeah,
like as a nurse, and so I've tried it. I've just tried it, sort of like when I'm triaging,
yeah,
I'm just sort of like trying
yeah,
to ask sort of like a couple of extra questions to see,
yeah,
like how it would go,
yeah,
and I feel like it probably is better that the clinician does it for that
yeah,
consistency of what you're talking
yeah.
about.
The other things are things like consent as well, that the participants actually consent to those questions.
Yeah, so you could do your normal triage. In my head,
Yeah,
I was thinking you could do your normal triage,
yeah,
and then when you get to that part, you could ask them if they would consent to answering the 3 questions or whatever
yeah,
as a part of a research
yeah,
project,
yeah,
doing it that way.
yeah. That's always a possibility. Yeah. And then the another thing that I know is that if this is happening when emergency is really, really busy, is there a chance then that the questions don't get asked, and that may be a time when some of those questions should be being asked?
Yeah, that was what we were
Yeah,
talking about. Like, so say if you get 5,000 people
yeah,
through in a month,
yeah,
like, do you just, yeah, how do you, like, do you make sure
yeah.
that every
So
patient gets it, or like a portion, like how,
you,
yeah,
you
just how?
you'd be trying that everyone was asked to consent and answer the questions. If people say no, well, then there's nothing you can do about that.
Yep.
And that's just the way it is. Um, but you don't want to have it in such a way that you're collecting data from a particular set of people that show up at particular times or don't show up at particular times, whatever the matter might be.
Yeah. And
Um,
EDs do have a pattern.
yeah.
Like there is a distinct pattern of that. So you would, yeah.
In the end, all you can do is make the best decision possible given the information you have and anything you've been able to find from the literature. Whether that's academic literature or grey literature, it doesn't matter, other people that have tried similar things. And then you make the logical best decision that you can. And that's what you state when you're writing it up. Look, here's one of the limitations is we had to make a decision. And the decision we made was this one for these reasons. And you
Yeah.
have to then just live with
Yep.
that, with
Because
that
there's nothing
decision.
in the, we've looked at, we've
Yeah,
done the systematic review, we've done the grey literature.
yeah,
Like there's nothing that we could
yeah,
find. So then we went to Queensland Health, the data people,
yeah,
and they said, "Oh wow, that's a really, really good idea."
yeah,
And
yeah,
but the systems, like,
yeah,
that's where we would like to get to, because
yeah,
the theory
yeah,
is that if you know that, say, a portion of the people
yeah,
come from, say, Moranbah, or
yeah,
like a small remote part of Mackay HHS,
yeah,
and you know that, like, say, they were seen by the primary practitioners, and the antibiotic use wasn't, like, say, the antibiotics weren't prescribed to and so by not having the appropriate antibiotic, they get they escalate to other places.
yeah,
Then what you could do out of that is go to that community and provide education and support to the primary health around their prescribing.
yeah, absolutely.
So,
As I
like,
say, yeah,
yeah,
you just have to be careful in wording and the number of questions that you can reasonably ask.
yeah,
Um, like it depends, because you can ask a question that's a yes no answer and that takes 1 second, or you can ask a question that has someone has to think about and that takes a lot more time. So the actual number of questions isn't so important as the length of time that it takes.
okay. Because the other day I go, this person come in with dizziness,
Yeah.
and I said, "Oh, how long have you been feeling dizzy for?" Thinking that it would be like a day or 2
Yeah.
days, and he goes 18 months.
Oh Lord.
and I go, "Oh, okay." And this is on a Sunday, and I'm
Yeah.
like going, "Oh, okay." Like,
Yes.
and I'm thinking, and I just had to ask him. I said, like, in the last 18 months, have you seen,
Yeah.
have you done anything about the dizziness? Like,
Yeah.
it was like, it was so perplexing. Like, it was, yeah,
Yeah.
it was, yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so what I'm hearing you say is make sure I get the methodology correct around, and like just stick to it to say,
Yeah.
and then make sure that I ask as least questions with the shortest answers.
Yeah. That cover your objectives.
Okay.
Because remember, you'll be talking the questions and looking for a verbal response. So it's going to be different to them being written down, where someone can peruse them and decide an answer.
Yeah. And should I once I do that, should
Yeah.
I trial it with 10
Yeah.
people or something like that, and then
Yeah.
just see? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's what you do. That's part of your data quality is you pilot it for, a night or a day, 24 hours, and see, or even less, or a shift or something, um, uh, or whatever, and see what problems you get with it, fix the problems,
So
pilot again if need
yeah,
be.
if I get to that stage of like,
Yeah.
so we'll just refine it
Yeah.
based on what you've said, trial it.
Yeah.
Can I reach out to you, and then
Absolutely.
I'll have the questionnaire, and then I'll have the results of
Yeah.
the pilot, and then you've got something that more concrete, like
Yeah.
instead of me sort of
Absolutely.
just thinking what's going to happen. Like,
Yeah.
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 Okay. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you. That's been really helpful. Have a nice day, guys.
All right.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Yes, thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Bye.